March 17, 1854. A Louisiana plantation owner signs his name next to a woman listed only as Celeste, cook, property. 9 months later, 13 members of his household are dead. And every single one of them died screaming the same woman's name. This is the true story the South tried to bury forever. The Mississippi River in June smells like death warmed over. Not the clean death of a battlefield, but the slow, syrupy rot of 1,000 hidden things. Cypress knees drowning in black water, cotton bowls bursting with beetle corpses, the sweet sick stench of the slave pens down on Chapatula Street where men and women are hosed down like cattle before auction. Jeremiah Aldrich stepped off the steamboat Natchez in the summer of 1839 breathing that smelled deep into his lungs and smiling like a man who had finally found home. He was 28 years old, tall and raw-boned, with pale eyes the color of river ice and a mouth that looked like it had never learned how to ask forgiveness. Kentucky had spat him out after his father's tobacco fields turned to dust and debt. New Orleans didn't care where you came from. It only cared how much blood you were willing to squeeze from other people's veins. He carried one carpetbag, $42 sewn into the lining, and a letter of introduction from a Louisville judge who'd once bought a 12-year-old girl from him for $300 cash. That letter opened exactly one door in the heavy green door of Maspero's Exchange Café, where the real business of Louisiana was done between sips of absinthe and the flick of ivory fans. It was there, under the slow turn of punkahs pulled by silent enslaved boys, that Jeremiah met Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle. Marcus was 25, soft around the middle already, with the damp, nervous eyes of a man who knew his family name was slipping through his fingers like sugar through a torn sack. His father's plantation, Belle Rive, was drowning in mortgages. Samuel Rochelle was 46, sun-leathered, missing the little finger on his left hand, lost, he said, to a shark off Havana, lost, others whispered, to a card cheat in Mobile. He still carried the rolling gait of a man who expected the floor to pitch beneath him at any moment. They needed money that didn't come with questions attached. Jeremiah needed partners who didn't flinch at the answers written in chains. Within a week the Delta Trading Company existed, though never on paper where polite society could see it. Their office was a sagging warehouse on the edge of the Faubourg Marigny, where the law stopped at the levee and the river took care of inconvenient bodies. They dealt in what the old Creole families called les articles interdits, runaways recaptured under false names, free people of color kidnapped from the north and sold south with forged papers, and, most profitable of all, fresh Africans smuggled in the holds of fast brigs flying Brazilian colors long after 1808 had supposedly ended the trade forever. Jeremiah had a gift. He could look at a human being and see only columns of numbers: purchase price, upkeep, resale value, profit. When a woman from the Yoruba country begged him in broken French to spare her infant, he heard only the annoyance of damaged goods. When a manacled men sang in languages he didn't know, he heard only the clink of future coins. The money came in wet and bloody, but it came. By 1842 Marcus had paid off Belle Rive's debts and begun building the sugar house that would make him the envy of St. Charles Parish. Samuel owned 3 riverboats that flew respectable cotton bales above deck and human cargo below. Jeremiah bought Willowbrook, 40 miles upriver, 2,000 acres of cotton, a white-columned mansion that pretended to be Greek revival but was mostly rot and ostentation, and 143 souls whose names he never bothered to learn. Success tasted like bourbon and conquest. But success also breeds carelessness. In the spring of 1843, word trickled down the river like poison. Federal marshals sniffing around illegal landings on Lake Pontchartrain. Someone had talked. Someone always talks. The 3 partners met in Jeremiah's new study at Willowbrook. The room smelled of lemon oil and new money. Books he couldn't read lined the walls like a lie. A portrait of a stern ancestor who had never existed glared down at them. Outside, the May air was thick enough to chew. Marcus sweated through his linen suit and begged to burn the ledgers. Samuel wanted to bribe their way to Havana until the storm passed. Jeremiah listened, nodding, his pale eyes flicking to the pistol in the top drawer of his mahogany desk. He had already decided. 2 men knew enough to hang him. 2 men had families who would inherit their shares. 2 men stood between him and everything. 1 man could inherit it all. The plan formed with the cold beauty of a cottonmouth sliding into water. He would kill them both in the old warehouse, stage a murder-suicide over missing money, and walk away the grieving survivor with a tragic scar and airtight witnesses. He paid 3 dock rats $20 each to swear they'd seen Marcus and Samuel fighting that afternoon. He paid a crooked coroner 50 more to look the other way. June 17, 1843. The air was so humid the moon looked bruised. Jeremiah arrived early, heart beating slow and steady. He set the bottle of good Kentucky bourbon on the planning table, 3 glasses like communion cups. He checked the load in his pepper box pistol, felt the weight of the Green River knife in his boot. Marcus arrived first, complaining about the heat. Samuel came last, smelling of rum and suspicion. They talked for an hour about escape routes, about burning records, about splitting the cash 3 ways and vanishing. Jeremiah poured the whiskey, watched their throats work as they swallowed. Then he steered the conversation to the hidden reserves, the exact locations only each partner knew. Samuel's eyes narrowed. The old sailor's hand drifted toward his coat. Jeremiah smiled the smile of a man who had practiced in the mirror that morning, and drew. The first shot took Marcus in the sternum. The second would have taken Samuel in the face, but the old captain was already moving, overturning the table in a crash of splinters and ledgers. The broken bourbon bottle became a jagged weapon. Samuel slashed Jeremiah's cheek to the bone, hot blood sheeting down his neck like judgment. What followed was not the clean execution Jeremiah had scripted. It was 10 minutes of animal terror. They crashed through crates, rolled across the sawdust floor soaked with blood and whiskey. Samuel was stronger than his age suggested, driven by the clarity of a man who knows exactly how he is going to die and refuses to make it easy. He drove shards of glass into Jeremiah's shoulder, clawed at his eyes, whispered curses in languages learned in a dozen cursed ports. But Jeremiah was 32 and fueled by something colder than rage. He found the knife in his boot. He drove it up under Samuel's ribs once, twice, a third time, twisting until he felt the resistance give way to wet ruin. Samuel Rochelle died on his knees, blood bubbling at his lips, staring up at the man who had murdered his future. His last words were soft, almost wondering. "My son. Henri. He knows every name, every dollar, every ship. He's only 17, but he will grow into a storm. And when he comes, you'll beg for the mercy you never showed anyone." Jeremiah laughed then, a wet, ragged sound through his ruined cheek. He thought it was the delusion of a dying man. He was wrong. He spent the next 4 hours arranging the stage. Marcus's body slumped with his own pistol in his dead hand pointed at Samuel, Samuel with a knife clutched in dying fingers, money scattered like an afterthought, the safe forced open. He cut his own arms with Samuel's broken bottle to prove he'd fought for his life. When the police arrived, bleary and bribable, they saw exactly what he wanted them to see. 2 greedy partners dead in a quarrel. 1 innocent survivor, bloodied but honorable. Case closed. Warehouse demolished a week later. Evidence gone forever. Within a month Jeremiah had forged letters of transfer, emptied every secret account, claimed every boat, every acre, every hidden cache. $60,000 in 1843 money, an empire built on bones. He stood on the gallery of Willowbrook Plantation at sunset, glass of bourbon in hand, watching his new slaves bend under the weight of cotton sacks that would never be enough, and felt like God. He never noticed the 2 young men watching him from a distance. One was 22, dark-haired, with eyes that had stopped believing in mercy the day they lowered his brother into Louisiana mud. The other was 17, blonde and scholarly, already mapping vengeance the way other boys mapped pirate treasure. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle. They shook hands exactly once, in the back room of a decaying café on Rue de Chartres, over a table scarred by 100 knives. Philippe laid out the coded ledgers he had stolen the night Marcus died. Henri laid out bank records, ship manifests, witness statements bought with his father's last honest dollars. They did not swear an oath. They didn't need to. They simply looked at each other across candlelight and understood. This would take years. Jeremiah Aldrich thought he had buried his past under money and lies. They would make him dig it up, piece by screaming piece, and choke on every shovelful. Because some sins don't die with the witnesses. Some sins grow teeth. And in the black, wet heart of Louisiana, teeth like that take their time. But they always find the throat they were meant to tear out. Screen fades to black. A single line of white text appears slowly. Next time, the slow, surgical destruction of everything Jeremiah Aldrich loved. And the enslaved cook who would become the instrument of God's own vengeance. The river fog that night was thick enough to choke on. It rolled in off the Mississippi like the breath of something ancient and vengeful, swallowing gas lamps whole, turning the streets of New Orleans into a city of drowned ghosts. Men who walked those streets after midnight carried lanterns not for light but for comfort, because the darkness felt personal, like it knew your name and had come to collect. Jeremiah Aldrich walked through that fog carrying a leather satchel that weighed more than his soul. $8,000 in banknotes and gold coin, every cent he could scrape together by selling breeding women, mortgaging next year's cotton before it was even planted, pawning his dead mother's silver. Willowbrook was bleeding out. Creditors circled like buzzards. The big house that had once pretended to be Mount Vernon now had shingles curling like dead fingers and galleries sagging with rot. He told himself this one night would fix everything. The gambling den was a converted sugar warehouse on Chapatula Street, windows painted black, doors guarded by men who would kill you for looking at them wrong. Inside, the air was blue with cigar smoke and the sour sweat of desperate men. A single chandelier made of ship's lanterns swung overhead, throwing shadows that crawled across the walls like spiders. The table was green felt, scarred by 1,000 knives and 1,000,000 lies. 5 players already sat there when Jeremiah arrived. He knew none of them by name, only by reputation. River sharks, cotton factors with blood on their ledgers, a Creole whose family had owned half of Louisiana before the Americans came. They greeted him with the polite hunger of wolves who have already smelled the wound. He sat. Cards whispered. Chips clacked like bones. For the first hour fortune flirted with him. He won a pot of 1,200 on a bluff that made the Creole throw his hand into the spittoon in disgust. He felt the old swagger return, the cold certainty that had let him murder 2 men and sleep like a baby afterward. He drank. The bourbon was good, too good. He did not notice that every time his glass emptied it was refilled by a silent black steward whose eyes never lifted from the floor. By midnight he was down 4,000. By 1 o'clock he was down 6. The hands blurred together. Every time he thought he smelled a bluff, the river card betrayed him. Every time he folded, the winning hand was laid down just slowly enough for him to see what he'd thrown away. The other players laughed softly, the way men laugh at a hanging when the trapdoor drops. He began to borrow from the house. Markers in his own blood-red ink. 500. 1,000. 2. At 2:30 in the morning the fog outside pressed against the blacked-out windows like it wanted in. Only 3 players remained: Jeremiah, the cold-eyed stranger with the faint French accent who had been winning all night, and Philippe Deveau, though Jeremiah did not yet know the name. The stranger dealt 5-card stud with the lazy grace of a priest dealing communion wafers. Whole cards down. First up card, King of Diamonds for Jeremiah. He felt his heart kick, a drowning man seeing driftwood. Betting was savage. Jeremiah went all in on the last 3,000 in front of him, plus another 10,000 in markers he could never hope to pay. The stranger called without hesitation. Philippe matched the bet and raised another 5, smiling the small, polite smile of a man watching a rat finally enter the trap. Turn. River. Jeremiah's kings became kings over 7s. The stranger turned over queens full. The felt drank Jeremiah's sweat. The room tilted. He sat very still, staring at the scattered cards as if they might rearrange themselves if he prayed hard enough. The other players melted away into the fog like they had never existed. Only the stranger remained, gathering chips with calm, methodical hands. Then Philippe stepped out of the shadows near the door. The chandelier light caught his face and Jeremiah felt his bowels turn to ice water. Marcus Devo's face, younger, harder, carved from the same bone but stripped of every softness. The eyes were the worst, calm, ancient, patient as cypress knees waiting for a body to sink. Philippe did not speak at first. He simply walked forward, pulled out the chair Marcus had died in 11 years earlier, and sat. Another man emerged from the darkness behind Jeremiah, blond, spectacles flashing in the lamplight, carrying a leather folio like a lawyer come to read a will. Henri Rochelle. The circle closed. Jeremiah tried to stand. His legs would not obey. The bourbon, he realized dimly, had been more than bourbon. Philippe spoke first, voice soft, almost tender. You look unwell, Jeremiah.
Sit.
We have a proposal. Henri laid the folio on the table and opened it. Inside were documents, mortgage papers on Willowbrook, promissory notes in Jeremiah's own handwriting, a sheriff's foreclosure notice dated the following Monday. Tomorrow at dawn, Henri said, the bank seizes everything. The land, the house, the cotton still in the field, and every man, woman, and child you pretend to own. You will be sold for debt. Louisiana law is quite clear. A white man can be sold for debt. They'll parade you on the same block you once paraded others. Imagine the laughter. Jeremiah's tongue felt like felt. You can't. We can, Philippe interrupted gently. We have. Every marker you signed tonight is held by us. Every loan you begged for over the last 6 years was arranged by us. Every crop failure, every spoiled shipment, every horse that threw a shoe at the races, every card that betrayed you tonight, every drop of bourbon that loosened your tongue, we were there. He leaned closer. The scar on Jeremiah's cheek, the one Samuel Rochelle had given him with a broken bottle, began to burn like it remembered. But we are not unreasonable men, Philippe continued. We offer you a way to keep your life, your freedom, even, perhaps, a little dignity. Henri slid a single sheet of rich cream paper across the table. At the top, embossed in crimson wax, was the seal of the parish of St. Charles. A marriage license. Pre-filled. Jeremiah Aldrich, and Celeste, cook, aged 38 years, property of the aforesaid Jeremiah Aldrich. Jeremiah stared at it like it was written in blood. Marry her, Henri said. Legally. In church, with witnesses. Make her your lawful wife under the laws of Louisiana. Do this, and your debts disappear. Willowbrook remains yours. You walk out of here tonight a free man. Jeremiah tried to laugh. It came out a croak. You're insane. Philippe's smile never reached his eyes. Insane is murdering your partners and thinking their sons would forget. Insane is tearing a mother from her children and thinking she would forgive. Insane is believing money could bury the past. He reached into his coat and laid a tintype photograph on the table. Celeste. Not the broken field hand Jeremiah saw every day. This woman stood straight-backed in a Sunday dress, eyes burning straight through the camera lens with a hatred so pure it shimmered. She has agreed, Philippe said. She has conditions, of course. Freedom for herself after you are no longer in need of a wife. Safe passage north. Her children found and purchased if they still live. Small prices. Jeremiah's mind raced through every escape and slammed into walls at every turn. He was alone. Armed men stood at every door. The fog outside would swallow screams. Even if he somehow made it to the street, he was bankrupt, ruined, hunted. He looked at the marriage license again. One signature and he lived. One signature and he condemned himself to a lifetime chained to the woman whose eyes promised slow murder. Philippe produced a pen. The nib gleamed like a fong. Think of it as penance, Jeremiah. The Lord does love a good wedding. Somewhere outside, a ship's horn moaned through the fog like a dying thing. Jeremiah Aldrich picked up the pen. His hand did not shake. It had stopped shaking years ago, the night he put a bullet in Marcus Devo's heart. But inside, something small and civilized screamed and clawed at the walls of his chest and found no way out. He signed. The ink looked black in the lamplight, but he could have sworn it was red. Philippe took the license, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside his coat next to his heart. Excellent, he said. The ceremony is scheduled for March 17th at St. Louis Cathedral. Celeste insisted on consecrated ground. She has a sense of humor, our Celeste. Henri closed the folio with a soft snap. Oh, one more thing, he added almost as an afterthought. The 13 people who will die in the months after your wedding? They volunteered. Every one of them has a reason. Some lost children, whipped backs, burned cabins, graves you never bothered to mark. They asked only that they be allowed to watch you suffer first. Jeremiah lunged then, a last animal reflex. Philippe caught his wrist with a grip like iron and forced him back into the chair. "Easy," he whispered. "You'll need your strength. You have a bride to court." They left him there in the empty warehouse with the scattered cards and the smell of gun oil and river rot. The fog swallowed them whole. He sat until dawn, alone with the echo of two dead men laughing softly in the dark. And somewhere upriver, in the kitchen of Willowbrook Plantation, Celeste stood over a pot of simmering roux and smiled for the first time in 7 years. The spoon in her hand moved slow, deliberate circles. Like a clock counting down. Screen fades to black. White text drips down like blood. Next time, the wedding that horrified Louisiana, and the 13 deaths that made grown men whisper about the wrath of a righteous God. The morning of the wedding, the sky over Willowbrook Plantation looked bruised. Heavy purple clouds pressed down on the cotton fields like the lid of a coffin. The air was so thick with coming rain that every breath tasted of iron and graveyard dirt. Cicadas screamed in the live oaks as if they already knew what kind of sacrament was about to be performed beneath their branches. Jeremiah Aldrich had not closed his eyes for 72 hours. His reflection in the cracked cheval glass showed a stranger, cheek sunken, scar livid against ash-gray skin, eyes red as a butchered hog's. The black broadcloth suit he had worn to his mother's funeral in Kentucky hung loose on his frame now. He had lost 20 pounds since the night in the warehouse, 20 pounds of pride and sleep and the illusion of safety. He tried to knot his cravat 3 times. Each time his fingers shook so violently the silk slipped like a noose. Downstairs, the house that had once been his kingdom now crawled with strangers putting up decorations he had not ordered. White ribbons twisted around the banisters like bandages. Camellias floated in silver bowls, blood-red camellias that looked wet even when dry. In the kitchen, Celeste moved among her helpers with the calm authority of a general before battle. She wore a simple Osnaburg dress for now, but a wedding gown of dove-gray silk waited upstairs, paid for with Aldrich's own coin, cut to fit the body he had mocked for years as the fat cook. He had tried, once, at dawn, to run. He made it as far as the stables before he found every horse gone and 2 silent black men leaning on rifles, watching him with the mild curiosity of men watching a rat decide which corner of the trap to chew first. Philippe's men. Henry's men. Or maybe just men who had once belonged to Aldrich and now belonged to a future that did not include him breathing freely ever again. He came back inside and vomited bile into a chamber pot while Celeste's voice drifted up the stairwell, giving orders about the way his wife would have if he had ever been foolish enough to marry a white woman. At 4 o'clock the guests began to arrive. Carriages rolled up the live oak avenue like a funeral cortege in reverse. Planters in frock coats, their wives clutching parasols against the threatening rain, young blades already half drunk on the absurdity of it all. They had been told, in invitations written in Aldrich's own forged hand, that their host had undergone a profound religious awakening and wished to make public atonement by raising up one of God's humble servants into the sacred covenant of marriage. Most came for the spectacle. Some came hoping to buy Willowbrook cheap when the madman was finally locked away. A few came because they secretly feared the same God who had apparently touched Jeremiah Aldrich might one day touch them. They gathered on the south lawn beneath a canvas pavilion hastily erected against the storm. Lanterns swung from the oaks, throwing pools of gold light in the bruised dusk. A string quartet from New Orleans sawed through hymns that sounded like dirges. The minister, a sweating, trembling man from Natchitoches who owed Philippe Deveau $15,000 at cards, stood beneath an arch of white roses that dripped condensation like tears. And then Celeste appeared. Not shuffling. Not head bowed. The first shot took Marcus in the sternum. The second would have taken Samuel in the face, but the old captain was already moving, overturning the table in a crash of splinters and ledgers. The broken bourbon bottle became a jagged weapon. Samuel slashed Jeremiah's cheek to the bone, hot blood sheeting down his neck like judgment. What followed was not the clean execution Jeremiah had scripted. It was 10 minutes of animal terror. They crashed through crates, rolled across the sawdust floor soaked with blood and whiskey. Samuel was stronger than his age suggested, driven by the clarity of a man who knows exactly how he is going to die and refuses to make it easy. He drove shards of glass into Jeremiah's shoulder, clawed at his eyes, whispered curses in languages learned in a dozen cursed ports. But Jeremiah was 32 and fueled by something colder than rage. He found the knife in his boot. He drove it up under Samuel's ribs once, twice, a third time, twisting until he felt the resistance give way to wet ruin. Samuel Rochelle died on his knees, blood bubbling at his lips, staring up at the man who had murdered his future. His last words were soft, almost wondering. "My son, Henri. He knows every name, every dollar, every ship. He's only 17, but he will grow into a storm. And when he comes, you'll beg for the mercy you never showed anyone." Jeremiah laughed then, a wet, ragged sound through his ruined cheek. He thought it was the delusion of a dying man. He was wrong. The guests applauded politely, uncertain whether they had just witnessed salvation or damnation. Champagne flowed. Toasts were drunk to the groom's Christian charity. Children darted between the tables stealing wedding cake while their parents whispered that Aldrich had clearly lost his mind, but at least the cook was clean and would keep a good table. By nightfall the sky split open. Rain lashed the mansion like God himself, trying to wash the sin away and failing. The guests fled to their carriages. The string quartet packed up their instruments with indecent haste. Lanterns guttered and died one by one until only the great house glowed, a single yellow eye in the storm. Inside, the servants had vanished. Every last one. Philippe had paid them to disappear until sunrise, a small mercy or the final cruelty, depending on how you measured such things. Aldrich stood in the bridal chamber that had once been his alone. The big four-poster bed had been freshly made with linen that smelled of Celeste's hands. Candles burned low. Rain hammered the tin roof like coffin nails. The door opened. Celeste entered carrying a silver tray, a bottle of his best Madeira, 2 glasses, a plate of wedding cake glistening with sugar and something that looked like arsenic but probably wasn't. Not yet. She had removed the veil. Her face was calm, almost tender. She poured the wine. "To us, husband," she said, and drank first. He drank because refusal would have been pointless. The cake was moist, rich with currants and rum. He managed 3 bites before the sweetness coated his tongue like guilt. She watched him eat. Then she began to undress him. Slowly. Methodically. The way a butcher unwraps a ham he intends to cure for a very long time. Buttons slipped free. Cravat loosened. Shirt peeled away from skin that had gone clammy with terror. When she reached his scarred cheek, the one Samuel Rochelle had opened with a broken bottle 11 years earlier, she paused and traced the ridge with one fingertip. "Does it still hurt when the weather changes?" she asked softly. He tried to answer. Couldn't. She smiled the smile of a woman who had waited 7 years to use her teeth. Later, much later, when the candles were guttering and the storm had moved on, leaving only the slow drip of water through the leaking roof, she lay beside him in the dark and spoke into the pillow so the walls themselves could hear. "I know every poison in this kitchen, Jeremiah. I know how much nightshade makes a man see demons for days before his heart stops. I know how much laudanum lets a man sleep forever without ever waking. I know how little arsenic it takes to rot a man from the inside out over months while the doctor calls it wasting sickness. And I know exactly how long a body can suffer before it begs for the end." He whimpered. Actually whimpered. She placed one broad, warm hand over his racing heart. "But I also know patience," she whispered. "The good book says vengeance is the Lord's, and he is slow to anger. So we will be slow too. You will live long enough to lose everything a piece at a time. Your pride tonight. Your name tomorrow. Your mind by Christmas. Your soul, well, that was never yours to keep." Outside, thunder rolled across the cotton fields like artillery in a war that had already been lost. Inside, Jeremiah Aldrich lay rigid beside the woman the law now called his wife and listened to her. Breathing settled into the deep, satisfied rhythm of a soul finally at rest. He understood, with the perfect clarity of the damned, that death would have been mercy. This was justice. And justice, in the black heart of Louisiana in 1854, had finally come home to roost wearing a wedding ring. In the weeks that followed, 13 people would die slowly, horribly, publicly, each death pointing an accusing finger straight at the master of Willowbrook Plantation. The parish doctor would call it a mysterious fever. The newspapers would whisper about a curse. Old women would cross themselves and speak of brujeria, and the cook had learned from Africans who still remembered the old gods. But the dead would know the truth, and the living would learn to fear the quiet, smiling woman who now signed her name, Mrs. Celeste Aldrich. In a careful, triumphant hand. Screen fades to black. Rain continues to fall. A single line appears in white. Next time, the first death comes at Sunday dinner, and the devil himself wears an apron. The rain that fell on Willowbrook Plantation the morning after the wedding had the weight of biblical judgment. It came down in gray sheets, turning the red clay lanes to blood-colored mud, drowning the cotton seedlings in their rows like Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. The air smelled of wet rot and resurrection, mildew blooming on the veranda rails, Spanish moss dripping like hanged men's hair. Inside the big house, the floors creaked under invisible feet, as if the ghosts of every soul Jeremiah Aldrich had bought, broken, or buried were stirring awake to witness the new order. Celeste moved through the rooms like she had always owned them. She rearranged the heavy mahogany sideboard in the dining room, pushing it against the wall where a faded portrait of Aldrich's invented ancestors hung crooked. She ordered fresh linens from the quarters, crisp white cotton that smelled of lye and sunlight, for the bed they now shared. When the house slaves hesitated, eyes wide at the shift in power, she fixed them with a gaze forged in 7 years of silent fury and said, softly but iron firm, "The Lord has turned the tables. Now we eat from them." Jeremiah watched from the shadows of his study, nursing a tumbler of bourbon that burned going down but couldn't touch the fire in his gut. He had married her to survive. Now survival felt like slow drowning. The first month passed in a haze of deceptive domesticity, a fragile truce scripted by Philippe and Henri from afar. Celeste ran the household with the efficiency of a Creole matron born to silk and silver. She supervised the kitchen with a wooden spoon that cracked like a overseer's whip, but only against pots, never flesh. Meals emerged from her domain as feasts, gumbo thick with andouille and okra, pralines glistening like amber jewels, pain perdu soaked in cane syrup and dusted with powdered sugar that hid the faint, acrid bite he began to notice on his tongue. Neighbors called, fewer than before, their carriages splashing through the mud with the reluctance of men visiting a leper colony. They came out of morbid curiosity or Christian duty, sipping chicory coffee in the parlor while eyeing Celeste in her new calico dresses, simple but starched, her hair bound in a madras tignon that spoke of distant African queens. She served them with grace, pouring from silver pots, her voice a low melody of, "Yes, ma'am," and "Thank you, sir," but her eyes held the gleam of someone counting down to midnight. To the outside world, it looked like mercy. An eccentric planter redeeming his soul by elevating his faithful cook to wife. Whispers in St. Charles Parish churches called it a sign of the times, 1854, with sectional tensions brewing like a storm over the Gulf, talk of abolitionists in the North infiltrating the South like termites in good wood. Some saw it as folly, others as folly touched by grace. But Jeremiah knew better. The changes came slow, like the Mississippi rising inch by inch until it claims the levee. His morning coffee, once bitter black and bracing, now left a metallic aftertaste that clung to his teeth like guilt. Dinners of crawfish étouffée and corn mac choux, masterpieces of spice and savor, twisted his stomach into knots by midnight, sending him retching into the chamber pot under moonlight that filtered through lace curtains like judgment's pale finger. Headaches bloomed behind his eyes, dull at first, then sharp as Green River knives, the same kind he had twisted into Samuel Rochelle's gut 11 years prior. He blamed the stress, the shame, the constant presence of her, Celeste, now mistress of Willowbrook, sleeping beside him in the four-poster bed where the canopy hung like a shroud. Her breathing at night was even, peaceful, as if she dreamed of cotton fields turned to gardens of Eden. He lay awake, staring at the tester above, tracing cracks in the plaster that looked like maps of his crumbling empire. By May, the dizziness set in. The world tilted during ledger reviews, numbers swimming like minnows in black ink. He collapsed once in the gin house, face down in cotton lint that choked his lungs like divine retribution for every bale harvested on broken backs. Dr. Hamilton Warren arrived on a bay mare slick with sweat, his black bag heavy with leeches and laudanum, the tools of 19th-century medicine in the fever-haunted Delta. Warren was a relic of antebellum gentility, maton-chop whiskers, a waistcoat strained over a prosperous belly, eyes sharp from years diagnosing yellow jack and the wasting sickness that claimed so many in the humid hell of Louisiana summers. He examined Aldrich in the study, stethoscope cold against sweat-slick skin, fingers probing the abdomen with the detachment of a man who had seen cholera mimic poison and poison mimic cholera. In the 1850s, arsenic was the silent killer of choice. Colorless, odorless, tasteless, sprinkled into food like salt by unhappy wives or vengeful heirs. Symptoms mirrored the era's plagues: vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal fire, neurological decay that left victims raving before the end. "Your case is grave, Mr. Aldrich," Warren said, packing his instruments with a snap that echoed like a coffin lid. "Chronic exposure to a metallic toxin, likely arsenic. It builds slow, weakness, gut rot, nerves fraying like old rope. Remove the source, or it's fatal. Bed rest, Prussian blue if we can source it from New Orleans apothecaries." Jeremiah's blood ran cold as the diagnosis confirmed the shadows in his mind. Celeste. Every meal her hands had touched. Every glass she had filled. The woman he had torn from her family now tearing him apart from the inside, dose by measured dose. Confronting her was suicide. She was his wife now, protected by Louisiana's tangled laws that bound man and woman in holy and legal matrimony. Philippe and Henri pulled strings from the shadows, their letters arriving like ravens' wings: honor the union, or the debts come due. Accuse her, and he'd be the madman slandering his bride, inviting a quicker end, perhaps a staged accident in the swamps where alligators waited with patient jaws. Instead, he turned to stealth, a fox in his own henhouse. He began cooking in secret, slipping to the smokehouse at dawn for ham and hardtack he prepared with trembling hands. Water came from a hidden spring he dug himself, clay jug buried under cypress roots. At night, he barred himself in a guest room, the lock clicking like a pistol cocking, the bed hard and lonely but safe from her midnight ministrations. These measures bought time. The nausea ebbed. The headaches dulled to echoes. But the cost was visibility. Neighbors whispered at church picnics, "Aldrich looks gaunt as a grave digger. Won't touch his wife's cooking, thinks she's hexing him with hoodoo." In antebellum Louisiana, where Creole society prized decorum above all, balls in New Orleans French Quarter, duels over honor, plantations as symbols of white supremacy, Jeremiah's paranoia painted him as unhinged. Celeste played the martyr with Oscar-worthy poise. When guests dined, she served platters of jambalaya steaming with shrimp and sausage, her face a mask of wifely concern as he pushed the food away. "My Jeremiah's been poorly," she'd say, voice honeyed with false fret. "The Lord tests us, but we endure." Guests nodded sympathetically, seeing a devoted spouse burdened by a crumbling husband, not a avenger wielding a ladle like a sword. Her performance inverted reality. His caution became delusion. His isolation, insanity. When he confided in Warren during a follow-up visit, whispering of poisons and plots, the doctor patted his hand like a child's. "Nervous exhaustion, sir. The marriage, unconventional. Rest your mind." No one believed a former slave capable of such cunning. In 1854 Louisiana, where the Code Noir still echoed in laws treating enslaved people as chattel, the idea of one orchestrating a master's downfall was laughable heresy. By early June, Jeremiah was a ghost in his own home, trapped in a web where truth looked like madness, and madness like truth. Social calls ceased. Business partners fled. He wandered the galleries at twilight, watching fireflies dance over fields that mocked his legacy, feeling the weight of divine scales tipping against him. Sins of greed, murder, human trafficking, now repaid in the currency of isolation and terror. The climax came on June 18, 1854, 3 months to the day since the wedding, a dinner party Celeste orchestrated for their anniversary. Invitations went out on cream paper, promising celebration amid the gathering storm of national discord. Kansas-Nebraska act fresh in the papers, bleeding the territories with slavery debates. Guests arrived warily, neighboring planters in starched collars, their wives in hoop skirts whispering behind fans, Dr. Warren with his ever-present bag. The table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, roast duck in orange glaze, yams candied with molasses, cornbread hot from the oven. Jeremiah had eaten plain biscuits in his room beforehand, steeling himself against temptation. Then Celeste unveiled her surprise, a dusty bottle from the cellar, labeled 1839, the year he arrived in Louisiana. "Aged like our love," she said, voice lilting as she uncorked it before all eyes, pouring ruby liquid into glasses that sparkled innocently. The toast, "To many more years, my husband. May God bless our union." Refusal meant exposing his madness to the parish elite. Hands shaking, he raised the glass. Across the table, Celeste's eyes met his, the mask slipping for a split second, revealing the abyss. He drank. Fire bloomed in his throat, a burning vine twisting down to his stomach. Cramps seized him like demonic possession. He gasped, clutching the linen, vision blurring as guests rose in alarm. Warren knelt, probing. Apoplexy? Heart. Celeste flung herself over him, sobs theatrical and perfect, her body blocking the doctor's efforts. Guests clustered around her, murmuring comforts. Poor dear, such devotion. In the chaos, she leaned to his ear, breath hot as hellfire. Marcus Devo was my cousin, Jeremiah. Samuel Rochelle, my uncle by marriage. I've waited since 1845, whispering with Philippe and Henri. You tore my family, now I tear yours. Die knowing justice wears my face. The revelation shattered him. Not a pawn, a player. Every tender touch, every shared meal, a calculated strike. Personal vengeance, not proxy. His body convulsed, arsenic's final act. Lungs burning, nerves screaming, bowels loosening in humiliating flood. Similar to cholera outbreaks that ravaged New Orleans in the 1850s, misdiagnosed by harried doctors. He clawed at the carpet, vision tunneling to black, hearing Celeste's wails rise like a dirge. Jeremiah Aldrich expired at 9:47 p.m., foam at his lips, surrounded by fools who saw tragedy, not triumph. Warren's verdict, natural causes, nervous exhaustion leading to apoplexy. No autopsy in rural Louisiana. Bodies buried quick against fever's spread. The funeral drew a crowd under weeping willows, Celeste in widow's weeds, veil hiding her victory. Ladies offered aid. Men tipped hats. No one suspected the grieving bride had authored the end. But Philippe and Henri had scripted the epilogue. As heir, Celeste inherited Willowbrook, debts and all. Within weeks, papers transferred it to them for debt forgiveness. She vanished north, pockets lined with freedom's gold, seeking her scattered children in Canada's promise. The plantation transformed. Not sold for profit, but repurposed as a haven, a stop on Louisiana's shadowy underground railroad. In the 1850s, despite the state's hostile terrain, swamps, bayous, slave patrols, the network operated in secrecy. Routes along El Camino Real de los Tejas funneled escapees from Texas through western Louisiana, aided by free people of color, Quakers, and daring allies. Willowbrook became a station. Hidden rooms in the big house sheltering runaways, fields providing cover, riverboats smuggling souls north. Aldrich's empire of chains became a forge of freedom, horrifying irony for a man who traded in flesh. Philippe and Henry's businesses masked the activity, their respectability deflected eyes. Aldrich faded from history. No marker but a simple stone in the family plot, overgrown with kudzu. His name whispered as a cautionary tale, the planter who married beneath him and died mad. Crimes buried deeper than his bones. In Antebellum, Louisiana, a society of sugar barons and Creole aristocracy, where honor duels settled scores and slavery's iron laws protected the powerful, true justice often lurked outside courts. Philippe, Henri, and Celeste proved it. Patience as a weapon, revenge as redemption. Some sins demand atonement. Others, annihilation. And in the Delta's black soil, where roots run deep and secrets deeper, the scales balance eventually, in blood or in silence. Final screen. Fading sepia image of a plantation house at dusk. Text overlays. If this chilled you to the bone, subscribe for more forgotten horrors from history's shadows. What do you think, divine justice or human hell? Comment below.